We come this morning as our journey through the book of Joshua. We come to chapter 6 and that wonderful, wonderful story. But understand, this story is not just a story several thousand years ago. This is a story that gives us hope for the situations and problems we're going through today. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. The writer of Hebrews leaves us no question whatsoever. If you want to please God, it requires faith. You see, faith is the key that opens up the door to God's supernatural power. Martin Luther said, "God our Father has made all things to depend upon faith, so that he who has faith will have everything, and he who does not have faith will have nothing." You see, faith brings the invisible into the realm of the visible. Faith brings the impossible into the realm of the possible. Faith closes its eyes to what is seen and opens its ear to what God has said. Faith honors God, and God honors faith. We come to Joshua chapter 6, and it's more than just a story about walls falling down. This story is a story about people who were facing an impossible situation, but they put their faith in God's promises, and God delivered them, just as He wants to do with you. So we come to Joshua chapter 6. They've crossed over Jordan, the children of Israel have. They prepared themselves spiritually for battle. And now there stands Jericho, this huge city, as Deuteronomy says, with walls that seem to reach all the way to heaven. This was an impossible situation. And how are we to handle impossible situations? What are we to do when the doctor says, "I'm sorry, but there's no hope"? How are we to respond when we have a spouse who just walks out and says, "I'm done with this marriage"? What are we to do when our children turn their back on everything that they know is right? What are we to do when we receive the pink slip and we've been laid off from our job? This morning from the book of Joshua, we learn how to respond to difficult situations. Notice with me this morning 4 aspects of the Israelites' victory over Jericho. The sermon this morning is entitled, "What to Do When You're Up Against a Wall." What are you and I to do when we're facing impossible situations? We learn from this story in Joshua chapter 6. The first aspect of this story I want you to see is the problem. Notice Joshua chapter 6, verse 1. Now Jericho was straitly shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out, and none came in. Jericho in Joshua's day was surrounded by 2 massive walls. The first wall was 6 feet thick and 20 feet high. The second wall, in a little, was 12 feet thick and 30 feet high. Between the walls, there was a gateway that was guarded that was 15 feet wide. Now, Israel's problem, they had this huge city to conquer, but the walls stood there in their way. How could they ever get over these walls? The walls of the city had been closed. The people were inside protected, and humanly speaking, this was an impossible situation. In human terms, from their earthly vision, they had no hope. But listen, my friend, the inhabitants of Jericho protected themselves against earthly attack, but they did not protect themselves against a heavenly attack. You see, what is great walls and iron gates to a God who can make gates open of their own accord, as he did in Acts chapter 12 with Peter? What are great walls and iron gates to a God who can send an earthquake at midnight and cause all the doors of a prison to be open, as he did with Paul in Acts chapter 16? You see, the inhabitants of Jericho, they did not realize the truth of Psalm 127 verse 1. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. And see, the same is true for your situation. From human perspective, you have an impossible situation. From human reasoning, you wonder, there's no way that I can get through. But you're looking at it from an earthly perspective and not from a heavenly perspective. What's going on in your life right now that's an impossible situation? A Jericho that stands out in front of you that prevents you from accomplishing God's will for your life, that prevents you from accomplishing the dreams of your youth, that prevents you from doing what God wants you to do. It's a Jericho. It's a Jericho standing there in your way, crying out to you in defiance. You can't have God's will for your life. You can't accomplish those dreams of your youth. You cannot do it because I'm in your way. Your Jericho may be an unhealthy body. Your Jericho may be an unhappy marriage. Your Jericho may be a wicked past. Your Jericho may be wayward children. Your Jericho may be a lack of education. Your Jericho may be old age. Your Jericho may be fear. Whatever your Jericho is, you have a choice to make. Will you turn and retreat and go back and live in the wilderness of unbelief? Or will you charge ahead like Joshua and the children of Israel and go forward in faith? First aspect of their conquering Jericho was the problem. Secondly, I want you to notice the promise. Notice verse 2. And he said unto Joshua, see. Joshua, don't look through the eyes of reason, because the eyes of reason say you'll never get past these walls. Don't look through the eyes of earthly sight. You must look through the eyes of faith. He says, see. Do you remember when the children of Israel were coming out of Egypt? Pharaoh was coming behind them. They come up to the Red Sea in Exodus chapter 14, verse 13. Do you remember what God told them? Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Stand still there and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show you today. The Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace. Right now, there's some situations in your life. From the earthly perspective, they're impossible. From the earthly perspective, you're ready just to throw in the towel and say, you know what? I can't get over these walls. But you're looking from your perspective and not from God's perspective. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Now look on in verse 2. The Lord said unto Joshua, see, I have given into thine hand Jericho. The victory did not come from their might. The victory did not come from their great military background. It doesn't say, well, you have gained or you have conquered. I have given into thy hand. Jericho was a gift from God. And its capture was to be totally and completely attributed to him. And the same is true with you and what you're going through. You in your own strength, you can't get through that situation and that problem and that difficulty. Only the Lord can get you through that difficulty, and you must give him all the glory that he deserves when he does get you through it. But understand, they conquered Jericho because God had promised it to them. You see, when we have faith, it's not just faith in faith's sake, it's faith in the promises of God. Do you realize in this book, the Bible, there are 8,810 promises from God? 7,487 of those promises are from God to man. And God always keeps His promises. So you don't just have faith for faith's sake. You have faith in the promises of God. F.B. Meyer said, if any promise of God should fail, the heavens would clothe themselves in sackcloth. The sun and the moon and the stars would reel from their courses, and the universe would rock. And a hollow wind would moan through a ruined creation the awful message that God can lie. But listen, Hebrews chapter 6, verse 18, it is impossible for God to lie. And in that overwhelming situation, you are to have faith in God, in His promises. So no matter how great the storm, no matter how dark it appears, the only thing that's going to keep you afloat is the promises of God. The problem, the promise. Thirdly, I want you to notice the plan. Look at verse 3. And you shall compass the city, all ye men of war, and go round about the city once. Thus shalt thou do 6 days. And the 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns. And the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times. And the priests shall blow with the trumpets. And it shall come to pass that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when ye hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of that city shall fall down flat. And the people shall ascend up, every man straight before him. Specific orders for Joshua. God made it very clear to Joshua that victory would come by the children of Israel and Joshua following his exact orders. The men of war, the men of battle would go first. Then there would be 7 priests holding the ram's horn, and with the Ark of Covenant, they would go next. And all of the children of Israel would follow behind. They would march around one time, one day. The next day they would march around another time. And for 6 days they marched around this city one time. Then on the 7th day they were to march around it 7 times. So in verses 3 through 5, very specific orders are given to Joshua. But notice in verse 6 the orders that are given to the priest. And Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said unto them, Take up the Ark of the Covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Ark of the Lord. So in verse 6, the orders are not that specific to these priests. They are to take their ram's horns, and they are to take the Ark of Covenant and just follow Joshua. Notice the orders that are given to the people in verse 7. And he said unto the people, Pass on and compass the city, and let him that is armed pass on before the ark of the Lord. Strange orders. If Joshua had assembled the leaders of every tribe and says, hey, what are our options for conquering this city? Well, one of them might have said, let's just try to seize the city and starve them out. Don't let anyone come in. Don't let anyone go out. Let's just starve them out. Another one might have said, we could get ladders and we could get ramps and just try going over those walls. Another one could have said, well, we could get a battering ram and we could try to knock down those iron gates. Another one could have said, well, let's surprise them, and in the middle of the night, let's tunnel under those walls and let's surprise attack. But all of those were leaning to their own understanding. God gave them very specific orders. They were to go to war, but he mentions nothing of great military might. He mentions nothing of tanks or missiles or AK-47s or fighting in the physical realm. These orders were kind of strange. The plan, let's walk around the wall one time. Notice one other aspect of this. Notice down in verse 10. And Joshua had commanded the people, saying, Ye shall not shout, nor make any noise with your voice, neither shall any word proceed out of your mouth until the day I bid you shout. Didn't even tell them when that day would be. He said, you just keep quiet until I tell you to shout. Then shall ye shout. Complete and total silence. No grumbling, no complaining. Just follow God's orders one day at a time. And that is true with you and I. So many times we don't have the full perspective. So many times we don't know everything that God's going to do in our life. We're just to follow Him one day at a time. You say, why did God do it this way? Why did God have them just walk around the city? Well, the fact is we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. But just a couple of thoughts. God was testing their obedience. He wanted to see if they would obey, even if it made no sense whatsoever. You see, their parents were complainers. Their parents were grumblers. Their parents mocked the leadership of Moses and mocked God. Would their children obey even when it didn't make sense? Second reason, possibly, He wanted to show them every day the impossibility of the task. Every day they would go out and they would walk around that city and they would see those great walls and they would say, there's no way whatsoever we can do it in our own strength. And right now you're in a situation you say, I can't get through. There's no way in my own situation I can get through this. You need to set your eyes on God. The problem, the promise, the plan. Fourthly, I want you to notice the provision. Notice verse 11. So the ark of the Lord compassed the city, going about it once. And they came into the camp and lodged in the camp. So they go out the first night and they go around it one time. They come back to their tents and they spend the night. And they don't know the full plan. They're just trusting. But I wonder what they're thinking. I wonder if what they're thinking, how is God going to deliver us? He brought us through the Jordan. He brought us through the wilderness. How is He going to get us through this situation? Notice verse 13. And 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord went on continually and blew with the trumpets, and the armed men went before them. But the reward came after the ark of the Lord, the priests going on and blowing with the trumpets. And the second day they compassed the city once and returned into the camp. So the next day they do the same thing. They come back to their tents and they just lodge there. What are they? And notice the last part of the verse. So they did 6 days, knowing not what God was going to do, just trusting Him. Look down at verse 15. And it came to pass on the 7th day that they arose early about the dawning of the day and compassed the city after the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they compassed the city 7 times. And it came to pass at the 7th time, when the priest blew with the trumpets, Joshua said unto the people, shout, for the Lord hath given you the city. And then he hits pause. In verse 17 through 19, he's giving them further details about Rahab and what they're supposed to do when they get to the city. Verse 20, he picks up the story. Notice it. So the people shouted when the priest blew with the trumpets. And it came to pass when the people heard the sound of the trumpet and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat, or it fell down from underneath. It gave way at its very foundation. It didn't fall over, didn't fall out, it didn't fall in. It fell down. What a demonstration of God's power. This was a miracle. This was huge. Can you imagine looking at their eyes? They've been walking, they've been around it 7 times. They shout, and the walls come down. And they're thinking, our God is so great, so strong, and so mighty. There's nothing my God cannot do. And he did it. He did something incredible. Now here's the question. What brought down those walls? Well, you say, God brought down the walls. Yeah, definitely, God brought down the walls. But what did the children of Israel do that allowed God to bring down those walls? You're in Joshua chapter 6. Hold your place because we're coming back. Turn over to Hebrews chapter 11. The question we have to answer today so that we know how we're to handle the impossible situations we're going through. What brought down the walls of Jericho? Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down. Faith brought down those walls. The victory at Jericho was a victory of faith. Victory is not achieved by fighting. Victory is not achieved by force. Victory is achieved by faith. It is faith that links our helplessness to God's supernatural power. Do you remember what Jesus told the two blind men? According to your faith, be it unto you. And it's true right now in the situation you're going through. Your faith in the promises of God is what gives you the victory. It's not according to your finances. It's not according to how well you can fight. It's not according to your friends or to your fame. It's according to your faith that victory will come in that impossible situation. But look on in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 30. Faith always leads to obedience. Notice verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about 7 days. You see, these people were obedient when they crossed the Jordan. They were obedient in the rite of circumcision. They were obedient in taking the Passover. Joshua says, march around the city one time for 6 days, and on the seventh day, march around 7 times. And they were obedient. Faith always leads to obedience. It always. Go back to Joshua chapter 6. Let me show you this again. Joshua chapter 6. Notice verse 23. And the young men that were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brethren and all that she had. And they brought out all her kindred and left them without the camp of Israel. Notice verse 25. And Joshua saved Rahab, notice this, the harlot alive, and her father's household and all that she had, and she dwelleth in Israel even unto this day, because she hid the messengers which Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. But understand, before she obeyed and hid the messengers, she had faith to believe in God. Joshua chapter 2, verse 9. And she said unto the men, I know that the Lord hath given you the land. Verse 11, Rahab said, for the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. Faith leads to obedience. Let me show you this one more time. Look at verse 26. And Joshua adjured them at the time, saying, cursed be the man before the Lord that riseth up and buildeth this city Jericho. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, and in his youngest son shall he set up the gates of it. Well, God's put this command. Don't anyone rebuild these walls, and don't anyone rebuild these gates. If you do, you will suffer by the death of your children. God laid down the truth. You could believe His word and obey Him, or you could disbelieve God and disobey Him. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 34 tells us of a man by the name of Hiel. Hiel thought he could do his own thing, disobey God, and rebuild the walls of Jericho and the gates. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 34 tells us he lost his 2 sons in the process. So here's the choice. Faith, which leads to obedience, or not believing God, which leads to disobedience. Impossible situation in your life? How do you handle the impossible situations? Faith in the promises of God, which leads to obedience. You're here today and you don't know Christ as your personal Savior. Romans 10 verse 9, that if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. With your finances, you say, how could I ever manage my finances? You don't know how much debt I have. Trusting God, faith, which leads to obedience. You manage your money the way God tells you to. You say, what about my children? I'm concerned that my children are not going to turn out for God. Faith, trust in God, and you raising your children the way God tells you to in His Word. All of the impossible situations in your life. The answer is faith in the promises of God, which leads to obedience. Fast forward from Joshua chapter 6, 50, 60 years. There's an old grandfather out there in his rocking chair, and his young teenage grandson comes up to him, perplexed, wondering about this great problem that he has. I can see that grandfather say, let me tell you a story. All of our people came to the walls of Jericho, and there was no way whatsoever we were going to conquer that city. But God had promised this to us. So we did exactly what He told us to do. And the walls, these 30-foot walls came tumbling down. And grandson, the way you handle every problem that comes into your life, faith in God, which leads to obedience. What do you do when you're up against the wall? You trust God and you obey what He's called you to do.